I'm Faiz Rehman, and you're watching Cafe DC. Ambassador Cameron Munter is an ambassador no more. He's a professor at a prestigious college in Southern California. Pakistanis know him as a U.S. ambassador who opposed the drone strikes, or at least the way they are carried out. And he resigned from a lucrative post in disagreement with his bosses. We caught up with Ambassador Munter a few days ago in Washington. Take a look. Ambassador Munter, thank you very much for your time. I remember when you left for Pakistan, just a few days before you left, you were invited to a friend's party and I was also there. And you were very gracious to me. You and I were talking and you asked me for an advice for Pakistan because you were going to a country a little bit, strange. So I told you that please don't just rely on these big people, big personalities, go to the masses. And lo and behold, after a few days, when I started watching news, your activities in Pakistan, it turns out that you were doing exactly the same. So I started bragging about it, that, yes, he's the man, he's really talking to the people, he's really learning a lot about the country that he's going to be in for a while. So how was your experience in Pakistan? Let's start with that.
Well, thank you for your kind introduction. And Marilyn and I both miss Pakistan for the very reason that you've talked about. We were fortunate enough, even in the difficult days of our time in Pakistan, to really get to know Pakistani people. And by Pakistani people, what I mean is all kinds of people. People in interior Sindh, people in Punjab villages, people in Lahore, people in the north, people in the cities, old people, young people. And I think that's the thing that most Americans, sadly, don't get the chance to do because of the difficulties traveling to Pakistan. They don't get to realize the warmth and the openness of Pakistani people and the affinity that American people have for Pakistanis. Let me give you one example. Every time I met a Pakistani, he would say, look, I'm not a diplomat, I'm a blunt guy. I'm going to tell you the way it is. And they would give me an honest assessment of everything that was going on. And I really appreciated that. And that's the way Americans are as well. That convinces me that we have a lot of common ground, a lot of things that we feel the same way about. And that manner of being very straightforward and very generous, I loved it there and I miss it.
And I'm sure one of those comments must have been that America is not a reliable friend. They use us and then dump us when they don't need us. Was it something that came up repeatedly all the time?
Always. And I just wrote an article that appeared in the Atlantic monthly that talks a little bit about this problem, which I call narratives. There is a Pakistani narrative that the Americans use us and throw us away. There's an American narrative which is just as negative. We give them money and then they don't do what we say. So you have these two narratives. And I think what has happened is, with all due respect to the Americans who say it and the Pakistanis who say it, they get lazy. They decide that the narrative is more important than reality. So they say, instead of looking at you like an American, they say, oh, he's going to use me. And the Americans look at a Pakistani and say, he's a liar, he's duplicitous. And they make judgments before they get to know them. This is something we have to get past.
So are you saying that these narratives are totally different from the reality? There's no truth in these narratives, at least a little bit of it?
Well, the way I would put it is a little different than that. I would say that the narratives are not the whole story. They're not even close to the whole story. Both of our countries are diverse. Both of our countries are full of contradictions. Both of our countries are interesting and strange places. And let's have a little curiosity about each other instead of just relying on a simple black and white stereotype, because that doesn't help anybody. What I'm hoping is, in my retirement, as I deal with Pakistan, that I can help convince people that it's really better to think about the place the way it is, not the way you have a preconception.
Interesting you said that, black and white. What are the gray areas that you would like to basically focus on for the both countries?
Well, I wouldn't call them gray areas. Let's just call them the areas where I think both countries have a lot in common, but it's not as well defined as the kind of difficulties that we've had that you read about in the books since 9/11. We both have a great love of education. You have fabulous educational institutions, and many of your elites have studied in the States. Many of our people would like to have the experience. They haven't had it recently, but in years gone by, people loved to be at your universities. So education is something we have in common, something we can build on. Business. Americans love doing business with Pakistanis. They're creative, they're innovative, they're talented, but the Pakistani environment has been restricted recently. I'd love to see it open up so that American businessmen, Pakistani businessmen and women can work together in the future. Third area is one that I love very much, which is philanthropy. There's a huge philanthropic tradition in Pakistan. Most of it is Islamic and some of it is secular. In America, the same thing. There's enormous philanthropic sector that has good works here and abroad. We could work together in all these three areas, in education, in philanthropy, and business. This is the natural point of our tie, and it gets past that black and white notion of people who are good or bad.
You know, during your tenure in Islamabad, Kerry-Lugar bill happened. And the three areas that you mentioned, at least two of them, education and business, were a greater focus of that bill, of that law that became the law later on. Why do you think that failed to achieve those goals in Pakistan?
I think you're absolutely right that we have to be honest with ourselves, that the idealistic purpose of Kerry-Lugar Burman, which was after the return of the civilian government, that people like Senator Kerry were going to say, look, we aren't going to have this old idea that the Americans leave. We're going to be here for good. We're going to really invest in civilian ideas. It was very idealistic. And people like Richard Holbrooke very much put themselves into this effort. It didn't work. And in part, it was because the way that we put together our programs wasn't always successful. We had to build from a very low base to a very high base very quickly. We didn't always make the right choices. But I think on the Pakistani side, there was a tendency to blame the Americans when many of the problems that came were the result of the lack of reform in Pakistan. If you're going to have, for example, good educational reform, you have to have in the provinces, after the amendments to the Constitution, competent people running your government. And we poured lots of money into those provinces. And we may not have been so successful, but the Pakistanis have to work for their part on improving the governance, improving the ability of Pakistani people to fix education, because in the long run, Americans can't fix Pakistani issues. Pakistanis have to fix them.
Ambassador, there are people in this town in Washington who believe that the corruption in Pakistan also played a greater role in the failure of some of these programs because the money didn't really go to the actual targets. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's easy to use the word corruption and to use it in a way that's not very precise. What I'd like to say is that we didn't have well-conceived programs. The programs were not carried out as well as they might have been. There's always room for improvement. But what some people call corruption is really just the inability to deliver, the inability to get the job done. And I think that I would look more towards the need for Pakistani authorities, Pakistani partners, to take on the leadership in assistance and really focus on that as the main problem that we need to get through in order for the assistance program to work.
Ambassador Munter, now from the other side, of course, a lot of people in this town believe that, but in Islamabad and Pakistan, major cities, they believe that the money that's promised by the Americans doesn't actually come to the country. A lot of it goes back to the states, as fees to contractors, consultants, and everything is run on those fronts, even in this country. So they're not the direct beneficiary of that, aid.
I think Pakistanis have a real problem here because they tend to blame their failures on other people. I ran into this criticism many times. And while we can argue up and down about the question about the way that loans work and everything, Pakistanis cannot keep blaming other people for their own failures. It just isn't healthy. Because it's a convenient way of saying we don't have to change. We can put our hand out, people will put money in our hands, and we will fix ourselves. No, Pakistanis need to take responsibility for their assistance programs, not to say you're doing it wrong. They need to come and say, here is our suggestion for how we think in the education ministry we want to see a new educational program. Here's our idea for health. Here's our idea for job creation. Are you, the foreign friends of Pakistan, willing to follow? We will lead if you follow. But instead they say, you give us money, you tell us what to do, and if it fails, it's not our fault. So I don't like that because it's a very pernicious kind of argument that deflects away from the constructive way of building something new.
Okay, so you don't agree with the assessment that some of the funds that are promised for the country actually come back to the
If we
States?
talk about this, we are doomed to failure. If we talk about fixing things, we'll succeed.
Okay, good. Now, how do you like your retirement, by the way, in Southern California, the sunny Southern California?
Well, here we are in Washington where it's not so sunny. So I have to say I appreciate California a lot. It reminds me of Karachi, to be in Los Angeles, a dynamic city, lots of art, lots of interesting people, good ocean. So I still think about Pakistan. And I think in the areas that I work in academics and in some of the study groups that I'm working with the Century Foundation and the Asia Foundation, I think that we can try to work on Pakistani issues outside of the government. That is to say, not only do we want to make sure that the government and the governments of both countries get along, but that the societies can work with each other. And from an academic point of view, in California, I meet a lot of Pakistani Americans who want to help. I meet Pakistani students, and I see that there's a whole dimension that's really fascinating, that keeps me interested in Pakistan, and I hope optimistic.
When you left Pakistan, you resigned from a very lucrative, very prestigious job. Went back to a smaller town in California, Pomona. We have heard so many stories. There was one narrative after another. One very prominent and very highly and widely reported in the media was your quote-unquote confrontation with the then CIA chief, Leon Panetta, when he said, he doesn't work for you, and you replied that you don't work for him. And that was kind of, the breakdown of the relationship. Is it true? And was it over just the drone? Was it really?
No, I think that there's a lot of these stories that go around, but they're not really the story in its totality. The issue here is that there were a lot of issues that made me decide that my 30 years as a diplomat, my 3 decades were over. One of them was just that I was tired. Look, Pakistan's an exhausting place.
You aren't that old. I mean, you're still a young man.
I love your flattery. I love hearing that I'm not an old guy. But
what, 50s aren't
right.
old.
And I would say I'm not retired in the sense that I'm still active in academics in other areas. But I think part of it was that it was time to move on. And I think some of these stories that people have talked about are overdone. One of the things that's undeniable is that the 2 years that I was there were 2 difficult years. And they were 2 difficult years because the efforts that both sides were making in the counterterrorism issues caused friction. The way that Pakistan wanted to defend itself, the way that America legitimately wanted to defend itself, led to some differences. I think now, and especially since I've left, I don't think it's because I've left, but since I've left, that there's been a real effort to try to calm things down, to talk over where do Pakistan and America have common interests in counterterrorism, where do they have common interests in economic reform, etc. What are the things we can do together rather than focusing on the things that separate us?
Drone strikes was one of the differences that you had with the administration, especially with the CIA. I understand that you're not against the strikes per se, but you are against the methodology and the way they were being carried out. Is it true?
Well, one of the problems about the program that you're talking about is that it's a secret program. And I think we would benefit from having, and there's a call in the United States for having a more open discussion about the whole counterterrorism effort that we have, and I support that discussion. But at this point, these kinds of questions are not things that I can talk about. The reason is simply because we have to make sure that with our Pakistani friends who are fighting militants, fighting people who want to kill Pakistanis, fighting people who want to kill Americans as well, and who are against an open society, that we come up with the most effective way to do it. There are many tools, we all have different tools, and we have to figure out how to do that together. One of the things that happened during the time when I was there is we drifted apart. We can't let that happen. So I think that in that question that you raised, there's a lot of work that has to be done with the American public and between our 2 countries to make sure that we can be effective in fighting the militants together.
Well, now the drone program is not so secret. I mean, there's been, they officially accepted, yes, we have that program, and they came out with a new paper that Pakistan is going to be an exclusive case under that program. And this is something that, Pakistanis are very worried and concerned about, and repeatedly, even though they've been not accused, but things have been said about them that, they give you a tacit approval and then, just look the other way. So do you think now that you're retired and things are pretty much in the open, is it probably a good time to at least say a few things that can help,
I think at this point what I would prefer to do is to say what we really need is something that I was calling for even when I was ambassador. We have to have good cooperation between our two governments in counterterrorism. I think that those kind of ties have been rebuilt. They're doing better. And I think that we have to work government to government on these very sensitive things openly and clearly and honestly, looking at the difference we have in our political systems, looking at the differences that we have in our goals. And I think at this point, let's leave it to the governments to do that. I think it's important for them to do it. I very much think that the openness that's coming into the debate is a positive thing, and I commend people for that.
Now we have a new leadership at the State Department, Kerry. What do you think? Any advice for him, or any chance of you serving him in any capacity, maybe as a private consultant?
Certainly. I have the greatest respect for Senator Kerry, and I don't think he needs advice from me. He was someone who gave advice to me when I was ambassador, and he was extraordinarily helpful. You recall that he came out at key times when there were big tensions there and showed, I think, a very good understanding of Pakistani society and politics. So I think Pakistan is fortunate that Senator Kerry has, or now Secretary Kerry, has come into office, because he's a good friend of Pakistan who's going to be open with Pakistan and understand things there. Anytime he's looking for advice, I'm happy to give it, but believe me, I think he's someone who knows his way around, and I think Pakistan and America are very fortunate to have him.
I think his last trip was when the Raymond Davis thing was going on in Pakistan, and you were also there. And there was quite a disappointment on his part that he had to come back empty-handed, so to speak. Can you please just, reminisce some of...
One of the problems about the Raymond Davis case was that Raymond Davis, in our interpretation, was protected under the Vienna Convention as a diplomat. This was not accepted by many people in the Pakistani government. When an agreement was reached to release Raymond Davis, it wasn't on the terms that we feel were the proper terms, the terms under which his status was defined by the Vienna Convention of diplomacy. Now, the fact that with the help of many Pakistanis who wanted to see the relationship improve, the fact that we were able to get him freed and to move on was very important. I think John Kerry contributed to that. I think many people contributed to that. And I think that sometimes it's forgotten here in the United States that many senior people in the Pakistani government contributed to that. So it was painful, one of the most painful experiences I had as an ambassador, but I think it showed that when we set our mind to it, we can work together and we can get on beyond very difficult problems and begin to work as a team.
There is no denying the fact that this relationship is extremely important for the region, for Pakistan, and for the American interests in the region. And now that you have retired and have a different role, totally different role, you're an academic, you're on a speech circuit. You're here in town, DC. You spoke this morning at a very important conference. What do you want to do now to help this relationship? Everybody understands, yes, we need to do something about it. We can't just drop the ball and move forward.
I'm very pleased you asked that, because there is, for those people who are friends of America and friends of Pakistan, there is much that can be done. We can leave to the government those things that need to be done. I'm not going to be involved, for example, in counterterrorism. That's for the experts to deal with. But I think in the social links and the economic links, there's much that people can do, not just Americans who know Pakistan, but people, for example, from the diaspora, who have been very successful in America, who want to help Pakistan but are loyal, patriotic Americans, and also want to see the image of Pakistan improve. You remember that I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation things like educational exchanges, things like business ties, things like philanthropic projects. We have a lot of ground we can cover outside of the government. We can do a lot of things people to people. And I want to stay very engaged in that, and I think a lot of other people do. So that's my answer to you. Let's leave to the government the things that the governments need to do, but let's not forget there are many things outside the government that are open. Final thing I'd like to add is, it's not just a question of Pakistan and America. I think the healthiest way to think about it is to think about the South Asian region. I know that we have to be cautious about the prospects for India and Pakistan. It's a long history that's very troubled and very difficult. But the slow opening that has happened, the question about visas, the question about non-tariff barriers for goods, the questions about trying to talk about the borders at Siachen Glacier and other places. This is very, very positive. It's not just positive because it means there's a less likelihood of war, although that's very important. It means that the two countries, which have a huge affinity for each other, India and Pakistan, can open up to one another. I would love to see the day when an investor from Bangalore can hire the young people from Faisalabad and give them opportunity. I would love to see the day when the agricultural goods that I saw when I was in Pakistan, fantastic agriculture you have, that these things can be available to Indian people. Opening up to India, open up to countries like Turkey. That is, let's think about the region, and I think that's a very healthy way for Pakistan to think about its future as part of the 21st century, not trapped within its borders, but expanding and taking to the world all the things that it has, the generosity, the friendliness, even the music, which I found that Qawwali music in your country links so nicely to jazz, to international trends, to world music. This is something that is a gift to the rest of the world, not just for Pakistanis. Those kinds of things, if we can exploit those, if we can spread Pakistani culture and ideas around, that's where the future really will be good.
As the US gets ready to pull out from Afghanistan, what Pakistani Ambassador Shareda Hosein has to say about this emerging scenario in the region. Let's watch a report by Sarah Zaman.
The message that Ambassador Shareda Hosein wants to convey to Washington is that it's time to leave the past behind and forge a new path that takes into account not only mutual interest but also disparate strategic goals that Washington and Islamabad might have in the Pak-Afghan region.
We do not have the luxury of walking away from the region. We have to live right there, and there can be no drawdown for Pakistan.
This strategic compulsion is what Pakistan's ambassador to the United States, Shareda Hosein, wants policymakers in Washington to understand. She says Pakistan has been on the front lines in the global effort against terrorism, and while it will continue its efforts, putting pressure on it to deliver more will not help.
Do not expect us to deliver stability in an arena where 40 countries and billions of dollars in blood and treasure could not.
As Pakistan gears up for a change in civilian as well as military leadership by summer, Ambassador Hosein says the foundation of Pak-US relations should be public discourse, not personal relationships.
Our policy with the United States is driven and based now in the legitimacy and solid bedrock of public consent, because Parliament debated it, thrashed it, turned it upside down for 7 months.
According to the results of a recent Gallup poll, public opinion in Pakistan about the U.S. is at an all-time low. Ambassador Hosein believes U.S. drone strikes are part of the problem.
Do you really want the next generation, or my daughter's generation, the 20, 30-somethings, thinking of the United States as not building Tarbela Dam or opening up opportunities to Smith College or Harvard? Do you really want them to think of the United States as the entity that projects power through drone attacks?
Ambassador Hosein says Pakistan is committed to supporting an Afghan-led peace process, and she hopes that the current instability in the region will encourage Pakistan and the U.S. to work together as a stabilizing force.
Ambassador, finally, the Americans are withdrawing from Afghanistan. You heard the President's State of the Union. There's a lot of anxiety in the region, not just in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, it's just the whole region. What do you think is going to happen? Is it really, are we going to repeat the 90s, the late 80s, or is it going to be different around this time?
Yeah, I can only say what I hope, which is that I certainly hope that we can stay engaged, as the President has said that we are committed to, as we and our NATO allies are committed to the region for a long period, that the nature of our commitment to Afghanistan will change, the face of our commitment will change, but the substance will remain. Now the question is, what is that going to turn into? Is there going to be a way for the countries around Afghanistan to work together? I hope that, as I mentioned in the India-Pakistan relationship, I hope that they find a way to talk with one another about the future of Afghanistan. As long as people are able to cooperate, I think that we can find a time in the future where these business, cultural, educational, and other ties will be the essence of the regional relationship, and that we hope, God willing, the counterterrorism fight will be maybe less in the forefront. That's certainly what I'd like to see.
Do you think the economic downturn in this country may affect that engagement in that region, the American engagement? Would that be a factor?
It's very hard to say. I think that the commitment that I heard from members of Congress when I was ambassador was very strong. It was bipartisan. House of Representatives and Senate, the people who lead our country understand how important it is to get Pakistan right. I think what I hope we can see from Pakistan is a commitment to working with other people in the region and to looking beyond just governmental links. So it's not a question of government budgets, but it's a question of businesses, it's a question of exchanges and greater ties. That's where the real foundation of the relationship lies.
That was our conversation with Ambassador Munter. Send me your feedback and comments to Faiz_Rehman at outlook.com. See you in a week. Thank you for watching.
Let me give you one example. Every time I met a Pakistani, he would say, look, I'm not a diplomat, I'm a blunt guy. I'm going to tell you the way it is. And they would give me an honest assessment of everything that was going on. And I really appreciated that. And that's the way Americans are as well. That convinces me that we have a lot of common ground, a lot of things that we feel the same way about. And that manner of being very straightforward and very generous, I loved it there and I miss it.
And I'm sure one of those comments must have been that America is not a reliable friend. They use us and then dump us when they don't need us. Was it something that came up repeatedly all the time?
Always. And you know,
Hello, I'm Faiz Rehman, and you're watching Cafe DC. Ambassador Cameron Munter is an ambassador no more. He's a professor at a prestigious college in Southern California. Pakistanis know him as a U.S. ambassador who opposed the drone strikes.
I miss Pakistan for the very reason that you've talked about. We were fortunate enough, even in the difficult days of our time in Pakistan, to really get to know Pakistani people. And by Pakistani people, what I mean is all kinds of people. People in interior Sindh, people in Punjab villages, people in Lahore, people in the north, people in the cities, old people, young people, and I think that's the thing that most Americans, sadly, don't get the chance to do because of the difficulties traveling to Pakistan. They don't get to realize the warmth and the openness of Pakistani people and the affinity that American people have for Pakistanis.
At least the way they are carried out. And he resigned from a lucrative post in disagreement with his bosses. We caught up with Ambassador Munter a few days ago in Washington. Take a look. Ambassador Munter, thank you very much for your time. I remember when you left for Pakistan, just a few days before you left, you were invited to a friend's party and I was also there. And you were very gracious to me. You and I were talking and you asked me for advice for Pakistan because you were going to a country a little bit, strange. So I told you that please don't just rely on these big people, big personalities, go to the masses. And lo and behold, after a few days, when I started watching news, your activities in Pakistan, it turns out that you were doing exactly the same. So I started bragging about it, that, yes, he's the man, he's really talking to the people, he's really learning a lot about the country that he's going to be in for a while. So how was your experience in Pakistan? Let's start with that.
Well, thank you for your kind introduction. And Marilyn and I both